Okay, so how is Ohio responding to all of this? I'm going to talk about Ohio, and then I'm going to talk even more locally about CCBDD. Well, one thing that's happened since all of these initiatives have been kind of out there is that an agency called Disability Rights Ohio, it's a state agency made up of attorneys, wrote a letter to Director Martin of the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities. Many of you may have seen that letter, but they sent a letter to him in July that really added a lot of pressure to the whole situation, because they were saying to him that Ohio really is not in compliance with the principles of Olmstead, the Olmstead decision, and that we have too many people living in institutional settings and too many people that are stuck in sheltered day settings. And so they really are challenging Director Martin to find different ways of supporting people. Now, Director Martin, at the same time, and actually for quite a long time now, he's had a group in place that he calls the Strategic Planning Leadership Group, because he recognized actually probably close to 2 years ago that these things were out there and he needed to get people together and start talking about that. And so this group really is close to wrapping up its work, I believe. And what they have done is set some benchmarks for the next 10 years. Remember, these are long-term shifts. Some benchmarks for the next 10 years related to employment and community integration, and how, as a system, we need to move forward. And remember, I've said, as long as our trends are moving in that direction, that more and more people have opportunities for employment and more people are being served in the community in community integrated ways, we will be okay. And so that's kind of what these benchmarks speak to. So for instance, I don't believe they're finalized yet, but for instance, right now in Ohio, the data shows that for people enrolled with boards of DD across Ohio, not just Cuyahoga, about 20% or a little bit less than 20% of people are employed, either in an enclave or in a true competitive setting. And so I think the benchmark for the next 10 years is that that number would raise to 50%. Not 100%, 50%. That's a lofty goal, but I do want to point out it's not 100%. So even Director Martin, he's not expecting that every single person with a developmental disability is going to work in a competitive situation or even in an enclave. Another thing that's happening in Ohio is that about a little over a year ago, when a new budget cycle started, the state arranged for a project with an agency called Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which is really what used to be called BVR, if people know, the Bureau of Vocational Rehabilitation. This is another state agency whose mission is about helping people get to work, whether they have a disability or whatever. Their job is to get people working. And one of the, we've done work with them over the years. Maybe some of you have had experiences with them over the years. And one of the things that we always found with them is that they really didn't have all that much expertise when it came to working with people with developmental disabilities. And so what Ohio did, again, a couple of years ago, or about a year and a half ago with the new budget cycle, is they put money in the budget to contract with OOD, so that there are 15 people now working throughout the state who have been specially trained to work with folks with developmental disabilities and to try to find them jobs. So that project's been underway for about a year. It has not been hugely successful to date, but I believe that the folks, at least at the State Department of Developmental Disabilities, are really committed to it and are trying to figure out, why hasn't it worked better than it has? What can we do to make it work better going into the future? And I think they're pretty committed to continuing that. And the nice thing about it is it's paid for by the state. It's not something that impacts our budget or that we've had to find money for. So in that sense, anybody that finds a job through that process is all good for us. They're also working on what I'm calling funding redesign. And because, of course, all these movements and systems change, all this is going to cost money. And so the state has some figuring out to do. And they've got a lot of details to figure out. And one just as an example, right now, as I keep saying, we use Medicaid waivers to pay for a lot of residential support and a lot of day support. But the way the waivers work right now, the way the reimbursement works, in a lot of ways, the system favors more segregated or sheltered type settings. And so the state really needs to take a look at, if they really want some of these changes to happen, they need to make sure that they can adjust the funding in ways that will make providers of service go in different directions and serve people differently. So just as an example, you know, the way that our AACs are configured, the waiver rates are very much aligned with how we provide services in that way right now. And so that's to a large extent why providers do it that way. We tend to need funding in order to serve people, and so we set up our programs to follow the way that the funding can be accessed. And how is the Cuyahoga County Board of DD responding to all these changes? One thing is our strategic plan, which I'm going to go over after this slide, really does focus on services to adults. We recognize when we set out to do our strategic plan this year that this is the area that there's been so much focus on. It makes sense for our strategic plan to focus on this as well. Recently, you may have seen an announcement from me about a month ago that I have made the decision to combine or merge our existing adult activities and employment services departments into one department. And the reason for that is, again, there's all this emphasis on creating more opportunities for employment, creating greater community integration, and I really felt that it made the most sense for us to take the talent and the human resources in those two departments and the financial resources of those two departments and combine them, and we could really have a strong department, all with the common goal of employment and community integration. And so that's a change. I made the announcement. I'm hoping to have that in place sometime shortly after the first of the year. It has not changed yet. There is an increased emphasis on employment and community integration. We talk about this all the time, and you will see that in our budget for next year, we actually have some money set aside for these kinds of initiatives. But also in combining the two departments, I think that people who attend our programs will feel some kind of a difference in that we will be talking a little bit more about employment. We might be asking them a little bit more about employment. And we might be going out into the community and doing more things, and we need to find ways to emphasize that. We also are focusing on transition age students. I'll talk more about this with the strategic plan, but we think that, or we know that it makes the most sense to focus most of our time and effort on those kids that are just graduating from high school, just entering adulthood for the first time, and who have never experienced a sheltered setting to begin with. And a lot of those kids are really motivated. They want to work. They want us to help them find a way to work or gain the skills that they need to work, and so it makes the most sense to work with them rather than, we're not necessarily interested in changing someone's mind who has been attending Parma AAC for the last 30 years, but we do want to work with the transition age folks. We have seen a decreased enrollment in our adult activity centers, and that trend will likely continue. And when I talked about the conflict-free case management, the sort of the solution for that, that's going to be a big part of it, and we've already been moving in that direction for the last couple of years. And so in hindsight, I'm glad we have been, because it kind of makes our job easier now. But the other nice thing about having decreased enrollment in our centers is, should we be visited by the Department of Justice, right or wrong, in their mind, smaller is better. Smaller is one of the characteristics of being a little more community integrated or community based. And so to the extent that our centers are smaller now today than they were a couple of years ago, I believe we're in a little bit better position than we would have been for that visit. Now, the last thing is very important. What we are not going to do, I want to stress this with everybody, what none of this means that we are going to disrupt services and supports for people currently being served in our programs. So we will not have to require or ask that people currently receiving services at any of our AACs or in our enclaves, they're not going to be asked to make a change or to do something different, or we're not going to force people to go out and get a job or force people to go to a different kind of a program. So I do want to stress that none of this is about disrupting those people that are, I know that most of the people that attend our AACs are very happy to do so. They're very appropriate going there. Their families are happy with it. You're all happy with it. And I do not intend to make any kind of change with that. Okay, moving on to our strategic plan. I'll go through this kind of quickly because you'll see it. The themes are just over and over again. But our strategic plan does cover the time period 2015 to 2017. Our board just approved it in August, at their August meeting, so it more or less went into effect immediately, even though it technically doesn't start until 2015. We received a great deal of input to our strategic plan, which is something that I was very proud of. We received input from providers, families, individuals. We had some focus groups, staff. Our staff did a survey, and then a number of us also went around and personally interviewed many leaders in our community, providers, county government staff, and leaders in the business community. So I was very pleased with the amount of input that we got into this plan. We did end up with several goal areas, and again, these are all similar themes. One is services to transition age students. Again, it makes the most sense for us to focus some of these employment efforts and community integration efforts on that group of people who are entering adulthood for the first time. Our actual goals in that area are to increase the number of summer work opportunities for kids who are in high school, feeling that if they had some summer experience when they had the time, it will allow them to be more employable later on. And then also we've identified that there's a lot of duplication in some of the assessment work that takes place when a child is nearing graduation age. And so we're looking at creating a better, more streamlined process there that will not only provide us with better information, but just be a better experience for that child and his or her family. We're also talking about increasing competitive employment opportunities, which would include training and support of private providers to help us with this effort. Right now, there are only really a handful of providers who have been doing a lot of employment supports. Many providers do more of like a day support, similar to our AACs, but when we talk about actually going out and getting people jobs, there have not been that many private providers come forward wanting to do that. So we're looking at ways that we can hopefully incentivize them to do that, but also provide them with maybe the training and support that might be one of the reasons that's holding them back. And by having more providers involved, the goal would be that even more people would have opportunities to find jobs, more people with disabilities. Also, we talked about, again, increased opportunities for community integration. And we are working hard at our 8 adult activity centers to get to know people, get to know what they like, how they want to spend their time, what kinds of things that they might be able to go out into the community to learn that would be in support of their other goals. And so our staff are going to be learning more about that. And again, just an increased emphasis on finding ways, finding opportunities, finding creative ways to get people out into the community more often. We've had a goal for improving our relationships with large area employers. And, you know, we do have many really good, solid relationships with many area employers. But the more employers we have, the more likely it is that they're going to hire people with disabilities. And so just kind of increasing our emphasis on targeting some of the biggest employers, trying to get their interest in hiring people with developmental disabilities, and also offering some support to them to make them feel like they can go ahead and do that, and pointing out to them all the benefits of hiring people with disabilities. And then lastly is marketing and communication for all of the above, which includes tonight's town hall meeting. so that we can make sure people are aware of the things that we're working on. Okay, is everybody still with me? I know there's a lot of information. Quickly, our budget for 2015, since it happened to be budget time, I decided to throw this in there. But again, it really does reflect the times and the things that I was talking about earlier. Our budget for 2015 is pretty flat revenue. Our revenues have actually been flat for some time now. And there are some signs of economic recovery, but it's slow here in Northeast Ohio. Everybody knows that. I know everybody's experiencing that. And what happens, though, is over the years, since we passed our continuing levy back in 2015, the first couple of years, we were able to start to set aside what we call a strategic reserve, or some people call it sustainability fund. And but now that our revenues have flattened out, we're having to dip into those reserves. And so there's some pressure, downward pressure on that because our revenues are flat. A lot of people ask me, when are we going to be going back for another levy? And remember, we have a continuing levy that passed in 2005, and it's 3.9 mils. And in the first year that we generated revenue from it, it brought in $117 million a year at that time. And by now, that has kind of frittered away to where it's only bringing in about, we're projecting for 2015, $104 million. So we've lost over time about $13 million because of housing valuations and just the general poor state of the economy and just some other changes in state law about certain kinds of tax that we can collect. So that is a concern. As we watch those numbers decline, of course that's a concern of ours. We do think, again, the economy is improving, and we may be able to get to the point where that 3.9 mils again generates $117 million or something close to it. But that's at least probably a 3 years off, and that's really just maybe a sunny prediction at this point, but we're a little hopeful that could happen. The state dollars constitute only a very small portion of our revenue, and again, we've kind of watched that funding over the years just fritter away. At one time, we received $20 million from the state, Dave, and now this next year we're projecting it to be only 8. So over the years there, we see that our revenue from the State Department of Developmental Disabilities has declined by about $12 million a year. This is just a pie chart that shows you our revenues, and it's a nice, easy, really kind of tells the whole story. Our levy is still more than half of our revenue budget, about 56%, but this federal number has gotten bigger over the years, and this is the federal Medicaid program, and that's why it's so important. That's why we have to follow those rules that they give us. But the nice thing about the Medicaid program is that for every dollar of service that gets provided, we only have to pay 40 cents on the dollar, and the feds chip in 60 cents. So it's it's still a really good way to stretch our levy dollars as far as we possibly can and serve as many people as we possibly can. So that's why we do it, even though it comes with rules and strings attached. And then here you can see the DODD revenue is only about 5% of our budget at this point. Last slide, just a little bit about our expenses. It's a very lean budget for 2015, a decrease of about $1.25 million from 2014. Our local match commitment continues to grow. That just means the 40 cents on the dollar that we have to pay. Even though it's a good deal, it's still 40 cents that we have to pay for every dollar. We did set aside money. I'm very happy to report we set aside $500,000 each to address the waiver waiting list. We know that in recent years, we really haven't been able to offer IO waiver enrollment to people other than people who are in really emergency or even crisis situations. And so we set aside some money to allow us to just address the waiting list and people that we know have been waiting for a long time, but are not in an emergency situation. And then we also set aside $500,000 for what we're calling community integration and employment initiatives, and we're just looking for ideas, pilot projects, things that we can try that we haven't tried because maybe we haven't had the funds set aside for it, but new ways of potentially serving people in the community, getting people out into the community, and also getting people jobs. So if anybody has ideas about that, we are very open to ideas, and we're also open to working with our provider community on some of those ideas if they are interested. Continued decline in staff positions. We make a real conscious effort every time there is, if somebody leaves, we don't automatically replace every single position. We're really looking hard at, do we need to replace that person, or is there a way we can restructure a little bit and not have to replace somebody? So through attrition over the years, our staff numbers have declined. And then just that our projected expenses exceed revenue by $13.25 million, which is still a very high number. That means we're dipping into our reserves by that much on paper. In reality, we tend to underspend, and we sometimes get lucky and find a revenue source that we weren't planning on. But this number is something that we are concerned about. The more we dip into that reserve, the faster we're going to absolutely need to go back to the voters for another levy. And we don't necessarily want to find ourselves in that kind of position. So this is a number that we're very motivated to try to reduce over the coming years.